College football nerds here to discuss USC and Washington. Y'all, we don't always get out to the West Coast, but we're loving the opportunity to talk about this one and really loving it because we finally got enough data that we feel okay about running our computer model. So y'all get to be the first this season, 2019, to see our computer model. I want to remind everybody, please like, please subscribe. It helps the channel out a lot. And y'all might be some new faces this time around. So hang with us to the end. If you like what we're doing, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can hang out some more. I've got a co-host with me. He gets nerdy with me every single week. His name is Josh. Josh, let's talk some Pac-12 football. I want to get into it a little later in terms of like who we think maybe is the best team in the Pac-12 because there's some discussion around that and maybe their playoff chances. But right now, for this game, both of these teams have a disappointing loss. That's their only blemish so far. So both of these teams would probably also tell you that the loss for their team is an aberration. And I want to ask you to start out, between the two losses, which one do you think is more of a possible aberration and why?
I think the answer to that one really has to be Washington's loss to Cal. And it's just due to circumstance. That game was a weird combination of bad weather causing rain delays, causing the game to start late. The game, you play a bit, you pause, people come back, that finishes at 2 a.m. And Washington was really in control of that game for most of it. It slipped away from them late. And I don't know how many people have ever played an organized sport where you have a game like that. I happen to have experienced one that ended at like 2 or 3 a.m. one time. I think it was like a 5 or 6 overtime game. Obviously not high level football, but you get the point. Weird stuff happens when it's 1 a.m. and you're trying to do athletic things on a field. It's just hard and your body gets kind of strange. Some guys are used to staying up that late. Some guys aren't. And everything goes topsy-turvy. So I think there was a really weird set of circumstances with Washington in that Cal loss. I think if that game had been played through to completion at the time where it finished, Washington would have won that game. That's not what happened. When you talk about weird stuff with the BYU game, it's kind of a different set of factors. Maybe you can talk about the quarterback situation or whatnot, but Washington Cal, in my mind, is definitely more of an aberration, particularly because it was a very unusual set of circumstances that led to their loss.
I tend to agree with you. I do think BYU was also a little bit of an aberration. It feels weird because Slovis played against Stanford and they had that huge win. And look, I still think it's an aberration. I think if they played 10 times, I think USC wins 8 of those. But, and people want to look at that Fresno game to start out the season before they had the injury. And they had, I think they were up like 31-13 in the fourth quarter. So all 3 of their wins essentially were either big wins, like the win against Utah, or they were blowouts. And then they have this weird BYU stinker. So I'm not ready to throw USC out just because of that game. I'm actually pretty high on them now that they've beaten Utah. Just for full disclosure, neither one of us were super high on Utah. We did a top 10 2 weeks ago, didn't have Utah in the top 10, and it's not a Pac-12 hate thing. We just think they're limited, especially at quarterback in the passing game. And I wonder, I don't want to say this early on to knock USC, but, when your superstar everything running back goes down in the first quarter, it kind of helps the team's run defense on the other side of the ball. So I think USC caught a little bit of a break there, but they're having to play a third string quarterback. So nobody's, they're not going to let anybody cry for the other team. And I thought he did pretty well. So let's set this up in terms of what you saw in the USC-Utah game. Did you see enough in this game where maybe Fink could show up and match what we think is a pretty high-level quarterback on the other side of the ball?
I definitely think there's some possibility to it. It was a weird game in a lot of ways just because of how it played out in terms of matchups and strengths and weaknesses in both teams. Matt Fink for USC, I felt like he played really well, but I really feel like not enough credit is being given to the receivers. Pittman and Amon-Ra St. Brown are really the two guys that are driving that ship. Tyler Vaughn's had some really good plays too, but It's really those two guys. And I think Utah didn't have an answer for the receivers for USC. One thing I noticed in watching that game, it was, I believe, Lewis, who was Utah's corner number 5, the converted nickel. He may have literally given up half the first downs that Utah allowed in the game. USC, as a team, only had 16 first downs in the game. That's not very many, okay? That's a lot of explosive plays, not a lot of first downs. And then of those 16 first downs, it really may have been something like 7 of them came on throws against Lewis. And he just struggled to get his head turned around on the ball. Didn't have a lot of he's kind of short, and the receivers were able to pick on him to a merciless degree. Outside of that, I'm not sure how effective USC was in certain ways. They got outgained by 76 yards in the game. Utah had 27 first downs to SC's 16. And Utah run the ball for 5 yards per carry. USC only ran it for 0.6. Really what you saw from that game, and I think it's what we've seen a lot from USC throughout the season, their receivers are really good. They're making clutch plays. They actually, in a lot of ways, remind me of Clemson in the playoffs and how they're operating. They've got a lot of 50-50 balls, and those 50-50 balls, that's an insult until you have the receivers that are capable of consistently coming down with them. And that's what they have in Pittman and Amon-Ra. So I think SC's offense is a little disjointed. I think they have issues. I mean, the complete inability to run the ball against Utah is a concern for us predictively, because if you can't run the ball in that game, it doesn't matter that you're strong in other ways. That's something that might crop up against a better pass defense. But I think their defense played very well, which is an underrated point. And, they showed that tall, possession catch receiver thing. Recent years has shown that tends to translate against teams almost regardless of the level of competition.
Yeah, Texas did that against Georgia as a function of their offense. Little Jordan Humphrey, just go up and get it. You got the size, not necessarily a speed burner guy. Maybe, their wide receiver last year, maybe not even as athletic as Southern Cal's, USC's, and still were able to do that against a high functioning defense. On the other side of the ball, and shout out to our buddy Andrew at PDog206 on Twitter, big friend of the program, Washington super fan and numbers guy. Hate he can't be on here. We'll get him on later on in the season. It was a last second decision to do this game. We've talked about Jacob Eason before and how we were high on him. We were high on him when he was at Georgia. Help me out here. Given the time that's passed, I feel like we're not surprised, or at least I'm not surprised, that he's doing well so far at Washington. I was a little surprised he didn't actually play in Browning's stead last year, because Browning was not as good as we thought he was going to be. But let me know your overall impressions of him this year. Is he exceeding your expectations? How do you feel about him, and maybe how you feel about him going into this game?
So my impression with Jacob Eason, and kind of dating back to his time at Georgia, Eason has all the tools to be a top shelf quarterback, meaning like a top 3-round draft pick. The problem he had at Georgia was that he was young and he was having a hard time processing things, getting the ball out, and he wasn't dealing with pressure well. Fromm came in and was the better guy day one and sort of, took over that program, obviously. I think Fromm is probably the better quarterback, but I'm not sure long-term that Eason isn't really a guy that can't even necessarily catch him. He has better tools than Fromm had. He's, a prototypical 5-star guy, very tall, huge arm. It really is that he struggles when he gets pressure, when he has to make quick decisions. I think he has some issues where just his release speed, and that goes from the footwork all the way down to the arm, isn't ideal. And you've seen that a little bit at Washington. Most of the time he's had a clean pocket and he can just absolutely tear you apart. When he gets pressure, he's not as good. But I think Eason has really met both of our expectations, which are he can make any throw on the field. I mean, when he's got a clean pocket and he's operating in rhythm and he's throwing to where you want him to throw, he can make any throw on the field. So he gives Washington the ability to make any play that they want to make. it really is, I think, with him a question of how well they can protect him and how well they can give him throws that he can operate within the system, not have to do a ton in terms of creation under pressure, because that in the past is really where he struggled. I think maybe he struggled a little bit in that way against Cal, but again, that game was really strange. I think Eason is a guy that can be actually a top shelf quarterback for Washington and can really develop into a true asset for the team.
So talking about Jacob Eason, and then, we've got Fink on the other side of the ball. I wonder, and I don't want to tip my hand too early, but I do have Washington winning this game. And right here, what I'm about to say is a big reason why, but I want to see if you agree with me or maybe you don't. I feel like, okay, so Southern Cal's biggest win, USC's biggest win so far is the Utah game. There were a special set of circumstances there that I think were uniquely in USC's favor that won't be there for Washington on both sides. So one, Fink was able to throw the ball up, Hail Mary, and hit a bunch of bombs against what was really, really poor defensive back play. Really poor for whatever reason. Like maybe it was, you've got converted players in there that really don't know the system yet or don't know their position yet or whatever it is. But that benefited them on, helping a third string quarterback sort of ease in and get a couple of wins. I don't want to say easy wins because he still had to make the throws. Jimmy Lake's DBs at Washington ain't playing like that. I know he's not got everybody he's had in the past, but he's still coaching the DBs over there at Washington. So that's not going to be there for the taking. And then on the flip side, they didn't really have a quarterback for Utah that could exploit USC's secondary at all. So it's kind of, to me, a double whammy for USC here where they're not going to be able to do as much from their quarterback and they're going to get a whole lot more from the other quarterback. And that really, to me, is the game in this one. I know there's a lot of other nuances and we're going to talk about data, but am I on to something here?
I think so. So is it cool with you if I go ahead and get into the model and use that as a springboard?
Absolutely.
We can really get into this discussion. All right. So when we pull up the model, and I'm trying to give a quick crash course in this. One, because it's the first time I've used the model this year. Two, probably fans of these two fan bases aren't as familiar with how our model works. We look at per play stats, meaning, yards per carry, yards per attempt, because we're trying to adjust for tempo. Running 100 plays versus 50 doesn't necessarily mean your offense is better. It just means you ran more plays. Then we look at how you do versus your opponents, how your opponents did versus everybody else, and we adjust for that to get an idea of how your offense scales versus the competition. We do it in a non-linear way, meaning we're not just going to say that we assign points per yard. We're actually looking at your team, and what the model is doing is it's constructing basically a scoring model unique to your team based off what the certain thresholds are for yardage or, different factors that cause you to start scoring more points. Most teams at something like 4 to 5 yards per play can generate some amount of decent scoring potential in a game. And then when it jumps up, you start getting like 6, 7, 8, then the scoring jumps up significantly from there every yard per play. Anything less than 4 pretty much is a complete shutdown offense. One of the intermediary stats this generates, getting back to your question, is percentages allowed. So we generate as an internal statistic, and it's a completely neutral statistic. What is the percentage of production allowed that you allowed in your games versus what your opponents did against everybody else? So in USC's case, they allowed 105% of opponent rushing averages and 101% of opponent passing averages in the season. What that really means in short is USC as a defense compared to their competition has been completely average compared to what competition has done against everyone else. You can say that's good and bad, talk about different reasons why that may be, but that's a flat stat. I mean, that is true statistically. In fact, usually we like to see that number below 95% because there's enough sort of trash teams thrown in for enough of your opponents where they've played, in Eastern Washington, that their stats are always a little overinflated. You should hold them under their season averages because they have all those cupcakes where they kind of boost all their own numbers. Washington, interestingly, is 120% allowed of opponent rushing averages. That's terrible. We can get into that in a second. That's probably a little bit of an aberration. 86% of opponent passing averages. It's really hard to hold teams to a low number in passing average. We see this pretty consistently. Teams even your best pass defenses are going to be above 75% of opponent passing averages. And it's kind of one of the interesting things we get from using this statistic a lot. Passing offenses do much better against defenses regardless of their quality. If you have a really good defense like Clemson a few years ago, I think, or like Clemson with their defensive line last year, I think it was like 56% of opponent averages. You can get crazy numbers, and we've never, ever seen past averages ever get that low. Long story short from all that, Washington has a really good pass defense. And frankly, statistically, it's really the one really good defensive unit in this game. When you look at the one common opponent here, and that's BYU. Now, caveat, I don't think you can necessarily look game by game against one opponent and think it's a be-all, end-all discussion, but it's an interesting case point. BYU had 8.8 yards per attempt against Southern Cal. They had 6.6 yards per attempt against Washington. They did get a pick against Washington, but obviously it was a 45-19 loss. Washington 30-27 win against Southern Cal. Threw the ball more against Washington, about the same completion percentage. The main thing is, by and large, Washington held BYU to far less yards. A lot of it was better tackling. It was better aggression at the line of scrimmage and just not giving up as many yard after catch plays, not giving us up as maybe a couple bomb here and there, but by and large, it was mostly just limiting Yak more than Southern Cal. And then conversely, when you talk about passing offenses, Southern Cal had 8.3 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions in the loss to BYU. The main reason they lose that game is that they threw more interceptions than they threw touchdowns. Washington, 10.4 yards per attempt, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. So what you're seeing on both sides of the ball, to Daniel, to your point, and I'm saying it on hard data, and the one common opponent, Washington threw for 2 yards per attempt more than USC did. They allowed 2 yards per attempt less than USC allowed. That's a really big deal. And to have that swing on either side of the ball would be notable, but to have it on both sides of the ball is a pretty significant sign that maybe Washington does have an advantage pretty much regardless of who's throwing the football.
And sometimes, and I want to stress, like, we're not a data-only channel. We do watch all these games before we bring our evaluation to the table. I want to offer another caveat. This is, the first model, meaning that we've got a lot of weird data and it could get sideways pretty quickly. But I already know what the score says, and I want you to tell us what the score says, because I think it's interesting, because it's probably at least somewhere in the ballpark with what we're going to pick. So why don't you talk about what the model says for a score, and then give me your score for this game.
So our model in this game, it models sort of an expected yards per play, and it models a score. And it expects both these teams to be operating about the 6.5 yard per play range. And it's pumping out a score there of 36 Washington to 32 USC. So a 4-point favorite to Washington in our model over USC. I think breaking that down, again, the scoring model is unique to each team. If you want to think about it, it's really low level, but you could call it something like a machine learning concept from that regard. It's saying basically that with similar yardage, and we're talking, it's predicting it similar to the hundreds. Washington scores a little bit more than USC does. I think, and this is where you get into the fact that we're a data-driven channel, but we're not data slaves. One of the most important things you can do with models like this is to look at it, use it as a baseline, and then figure out from there where our expectations maybe are wrong. I think one of the big things that's maybe off in the model right now is its perception of Washington's run defense. And I say that because they held BYU to 2.9 yards per carry. They held Eastern Washington to 2.1. Hawaii was 4.1 yards per carry, but that was a 52-20 win. There's a lot of garbage time there. The big one was that Cal 5 yard per carry game. Now, Cal has had on and off games throughout the year running where it's really unclear how good they are. And it's also just, that one game where they give up 192 yards on the ground in the middle of the night. And I think that may have just been a really weird set of factors causing that. With only 3 usable games, because we throw out FCS games entirely. There's a lot of reasons for that, most of it being whatever Eastern Washington season average is against FCS teams. I can't really apply that and say, oh, you held them way below their season average. It's meaningless. I think that Cal game is an aberration, and that's a third of your data. That's why the number is so low for Washington. But if you change that and you say, okay, rather than allowing that total against Cal. Let's say Washington's that their run defense is a lot better than we think it is, and maybe I drop it down to like a 3.5 yard per carry allowed. Then all of a sudden this game sort of starts to swing, and you see it more like a touchdown or more favorite for Washington. So I do think this game is close, and even when screwing with that number, it doesn't really want to give Washington more than a touchdown edge over USC, which I think I don't know how surprising that is to people. But Washington is the favorite, and I think if you start screwing with the data, there's reasons to believe it could skew more in Washington's favor due to the weirdness of the Cal game than the other way around. Now, as for my opinion on that and what it means, I think Washington is probably going to win this game by a little more than it says right here. For one thing, USC's consistently allowed points in the 20s all season. It doesn't necessarily mean Washington can't score more than that, especially given competition. But it does make me a little reticent to think that Washington's going to score nearly 40 points. On the flip side, what I saw from Fink in terms of his ability to just sort of lob it up, as we talked about a lot with the receivers, that style of offense can translate when the receivers are dominant, but we've got a one-game sample, and that's the problem. And I already spoke to the fact that their receiving core from Utah, and there's that big highlight with the catch and run, but again, there were a lot of plays like that where the receiver's basically dominating that one corner. I don't think that necessarily does translate. I think that was more about a bad corner for Utah than anything. And because of that, I think Washington has a little bit more of an edge. I don't think USC is going to score a ton. I have this game, I'm going to say 16-27. I don't think it's going to be super high scoring, but I think USC is going to really struggle to score in this game, especially when you consider USC has not been able to run the ball at times this season, particularly in the Utah game. If Fink can't throw it, that offense is going to shut down.
I'm a little. I think there's going to be a little more scoring than you, not a whole lot. I've also got Washington in this game. I've got 31-20 Washington. One thing that's holding me back in thinking that USC might be able to really be competitive or even win this game is I do think in terms of pure talent, recruiting, Jimmys and Joes, I think USC has the edge here, which might really come into play in skill positions and wide receivers being able to get open. I still like Fuller at Washington, so maybe there is an edge there. But I also think that USC fans are going to say, hey, wait, we just beat the number 10 team in the country, and you're picking us to lose by double digits. I don't think Utah is the 10th best team in the country. I actually think they were a good bit better last year. I also think you didn't beat the 10th best team in the country at full strength. Admittedly, you weren't at full strength either, but you're not going to be full strength this weekend either. You're still going to be fielding a third-string quarterback. And as you talk about in our model where if you add another yard or two per play or take it away, it changes the calculus dramatically. I also think the offense, this USC offense changes the calculus dramatically if you can't hit those deep bombs. If you can't score 30, if you on that and you have to sustain a drive, you might go from 30 to 7 real fast. And you might, on the other side of the ball, go from giving up 23 to giving up 43 because they got a whole lot more possessions. And I think we're going to see some of this. I still think USC scores. I still think they got a potentially good season ahead of them if Fink can sort of get his feet underneath him. I don't think it's going to happen here on the road at Washington, especially against what is still, in my mind, a pretty dang good defense. I'm going to leave you with this question, and then we can roll this one off. If we're putting something in the maybe USC can win this game, and we just haven't flagged it yet, are there potentially concerns for Washington that, yes, we said it was an aberration, but for whatever reason was able to lose to a team that was inches short of possibly going to overtime with an Ole Miss team that we think is one of the worst in the country, not just P5, but G5 as well. I mean, Alabama's a 32-point favorite this weekend, and they're probably going to cover that. I think they have multiple 40-point losses in their season this year, Ole Miss. So is that possibly, if it's, maybe it is an aberration, but is that a place we can look to see that maybe Washington isn't as good as we think they are, and that Southern Cal might get away with a win here?
There's the potential for it. I mean, we started this video talking about Jacob Eason and the issues he's had at times in the past. The biggest thing Cal was able to do in that game is just play good defense. And because of that, Washington's per play passing dropped by half. They were 5.4 yards per attempt, and anything below 6.5 is not enough to function as offensively. Mainly because you're going to have incompletions at times. If I'm throwing 5-yard throws or 4-yard throws, I can complete 2 out of 3 throwing incompletion and not get a first down, and that's just absolutely drive killers over and over again. USC has the athleticism to put pressure on Washington, and it's possible that they get in the backfield enough to really rattle Eason. And if they do that and they don't let him operate on tempo, it's possible that the offense shuts down the way it did in the Cal game. And I think the lesson from the Cal game for Washington really was, I didn't have any problem with the defense in that game. I mean, they played fine. They allowed 20 points. It's not a huge deal. The problem was that Washington's offense sort of cratered. And if that happens again, and that wasn't really a victim of circumstance and a lack of mojo, I think that then USC has a very good chance to win the game because Washington may end up not being able to score any points. That said, at present, I think that game was an aberration personally, and I frankly think that Washington is a really undervalued team nationally because of that one game. What this is going to tell us is, was that a one-off thing with Cal, or is that who Washington is? And if it's a weird one-off thing, then I don't think it's even a bad thing for USC to lose this game. It may just be that Washington really is like a top 10, top 15 quality team. If it's not, then, frankly, USC winning the game, while good for USC, is probably a bad thing for the Pac-12 because that sort of limits the number of overall really good teams the Pac-12 has available.
All right, y'all, that's going to wrap it up for us. Hate to hear the news today that Bryce Young is headed to Alabama instead of USC. It's kind of a gut punch for the Clay Helton staff that's probably looking for some kind of positive news, and maybe if they can pull a win out this weekend, that'll give them what they need. Thanks y'all so much, y'all, for hanging out this long with us. Remember, like and subscribe, and y'all have a great week. God bless.